still now, I will literally have people that will come to my surgeries and end up in tears when they're reliving that day. You know, they went there, this isn't some mass riot that was going on. This was a sunny day and people going there with their families to protest what they felt was an unjust situation.
It was like a military plan, and when miners arrived in June, you know, sunshine, bare-chested, and they've been picketing there for weeks and weeks, they expected it to be kind of the same ritual. You arrive, and the police are there in a great long line, and we push against it for 30 seconds, and then it's sort of over with, really, and the lorries go into the coking works.
Missiles were thrown and fencing ripped up. But when the smoke bombs went off, the reinforcements and the riot shields moved in.
By this stage, missiles, including pieces of fencing, were being thrown at the police. This afternoon, more missiles were aimed at the police as the second convoy of lorries prepared to leave.
Watch the stones.
But from the pickets there was concerted stone throwing and a new heavy weapon, a telegraph pole intended to roll onto the police lines. And then a hint of fresh tactics copied from Northern Ireland. A portable cabin thrown across the road by miners and set alight as a barricade, something the miners didn't want us to film.
Then, with stones being thrown by some pickets from the back, the situation became much worse as some police tried to make arrests.
You know, if the horses are coming charging towards me, swinging them big nightsticks, I might be built like Gandhi, but I'm not going to sit down in the road singing "We Shall Overcome," baby. I'll tell you that. So, of course we launched bloody bricks at them to try and stop the charge.
Well, some of them had had enough. Of course they started fighting back. Anybody with blood in the veins would fight back.
Media and police will have people believe that miners were rioting and throwing masses of bricks and lumps of concrete at police. It won't like that in the slightest. I was there, and only incident to me that occurred was a ritual push. It was a push between pickets and police, and it happened on every picket line.
We took the Orgreave statements to a leading Sheffield barrister to ask for an independent opinion.
But when you put their statements literally side by side, you can see that their statements begin in an absolutely identical fashion.
On Monday, the 18th of June,
1984, you've got the setting of the scene here as to the date. This passage here.
Eventually the pickets were repelled and they retreated. There was, however, a continual barrage of missiles.
Exactly the same in the two statements.
That's word for word.
Absolutely. If there is evidence that senior police officers in the South Yorkshire Police did apparently conspire together, and this would have been it couldn't have happened just on, I would have thought, one officer's say-so. If there's evidence of a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, then in principle, why should they be allowed to live out their retirements on their pensions with immunity?
In seconds, a pack of police 20 deep was fighting a shower of stones to hold the pickets back. The first cavalry charge came a few minutes later, and it clearly worried the pickets. The violence reached a new peak as miners surged forward against the riot shields. Policemen fought with truncheons under a barrage of stones and missiles. By mid-morning, the picketing had turned to rioting.
Hello, this is Breakfast with Naga Chetty and John Kay.
Claims of excessive force and false evidence, but the way police handled violent clashes at Orgreave during the miners' strike will not be investigated.
The police watchdog says too much time has passed, and 3 decades on, it's not in the public's interest. Good morning. First, our main story, and South Yorkshire Police will not be investigated over its handling of violent clashes between picketers and officers at the Orgreave coking plant during the height of the miners' strike in 1984.
The Independent Police Complaints Commission spent 2.5 years considering allegations of police brutality and manipulation of statements that were raised in a BBC documentary. It says a new investigation isn't in the public interest and wouldn't be possible given the time that's passed. Here's more from our North of England reporter, Dan Johnson.
A bitter battle on a field outside Sheffield 31 years ago. There was violence on both sides. Police and pickets were injured. But for the miners, that day still carries a sense of injustice.
You can't change the past. But we've always had a motto in the NUM that we inherit the past, but we build the future. And we want to be able to put this to bed. We want to come to light what happened so that people can move on and can look to the future.
The 95 pickets who were arrested said the police had tried to frame them for riot. The judge questioned the police evidence and cleared the miners. For many former police officers, a new investigation wouldn't have been justified.
If there has to be an investigation, so be it. But I think at the end of the day, it will work its way through the years and people will tend to forget or make up.
And now the Independent Police Complaints Commission has decided not to go ahead.
Our main story this morning is a look back to the 1980s because they were some of the defining images of the 80s. Police on horseback charging against striking miners at the Orgreave coking plant in South Yorkshire. Today, 30 years later, the reverberations of the Battle of Orgreave, as it's known, are still being felt. Ever since, those events have been calls for an investigation into the way the police behaved then.
The force referred itself to the Independent Police Complaints Commission 2 years ago, after a BBC documentary claimed that officers may have colluded in writing court statements. Well, the watchdog has now ruled against it. Dan Johnson made that documentary for the BBC. He's in Orgreave for us this morning. Dan, good to see you. So many people will remember what happened 30 years ago and be very mindful of the clashes that took place. And we'll still have some questions about who should be held responsible.
Yes, that's right. The miners still say that they feel a sense of injustice about what happened here on this field. This is where the Orgreave Coke Works was 30 years ago, although there's very little sign of it today. There is new development here. A new technology park is being built. There are new homes being constructed here as well. Very little sign of what actually happened here in midsummer 1984. But as I say, that sense of injustice that the miners feel has lingered on. And it was these police statements, about 100 of them. When you start looking through, you realise that the same passages have been written word for word by officers who came from different forces around the country and are involved in many different arrests.
South Yorkshire Police referred itself to the Independent Police Complaints Commission more than 2 years ago following a BBC documentary. It faced claims that officers used excessive force against picketing miners, manipulated statements and gave false evidence in court. Well, our reporter Dan Johnson is at Orgreave for us now. Dan, remind us of the detail of what happened here.
Yeah, well, there isn't much sign of what was here back in 1984. There used to be a coke works here, but that's all gone, all being cleared away. Just piles of rubble now. But we'll try and give you some of an idea of what actually happened on that day. Huge numbers of picketing miners, about 10,000 in total. They came from across the country. They were pouring down from that end towards the coke works. They were coming up from this side. There were about 5,000 police officers all here in a line guarding the coke works, trying to make sure that the lorries could get out and onto the motorway to get that coke to the steelworks. The miners thought if they could stop those lorries leaving, that would help them win the strike. But it didn't work. There was violence that day. It erupted. It got very bad. Stones were thrown. Police horses were sent in to charge the crowd.
Well, let's talk more about the decision with Bob Bird, who's a former police officer who was on duty at Orgreave. He's in our studio in Coventry, and here with me in the studio is Mark George, who is a barrister. Now, when it came to the statement that was put forward on your behalf, what did you think when you saw that statement? Did it describe exactly comments that you had made? Was it exactly as you would have put it?
I never saw the statement until Dan Johnson presented it to me, I think it was a couple of years ago. So in relation to the statement, I can recall at the time making a handwritten statement. What I was shown was a typewritten statement. Much of it was my evidence, but there were elements that were added as a preamble. But I say that wasn't fabrication, it was more a statement with regards to the offence of unlawful assembly, describing the circumstances at Orgreave that day. So in relation to my evidence about the individual that I was involved in the arrest of, there was no fabrication. What was added, and I believe it may have been one of the prosecuting barristers, sought to set the scene because the offence of unlawful assembly has a number of elements that are required. In relation to the arrest that I was party to, it was for an act of disorder. It was that wider disorder that then became the charge of unlawful assembly.
OK, well, let's bring in Mark George, because you have studied the statements.
Yes.
We've worked with Dan on that and studied them. What do you make about the fact that something like that would happen, where a preamble is added to a statement?
It's extraordinary. I've never seen it before. I mean, you would not... officers have to give evidence about what they've seen, what they've heard. They're not entitled to put into a statement what other people have told them if it's not within their own experience.
What about the explanation, though, that we were hearing from Bob? As he understood it, it was just a scene setter. It didn't materially change what happened.
Well, scene setting covers a multitude of sins, I suppose. The statements that I saw often had long sections, which had been... One of the things that was most remarkable was that police officers from different parts of the country, different forces who've been involved in different arrests at Orgreave on the day, had their statements contained precisely the same wording, not just individual words, but whole sentences, sometimes paragraphs, that had been put in there, and under the guise of scene setting, actually gave an account of what had happened, which a lot of the miners will say was simply the reverse of the truth, that the way that the statements had been produced for the officers to sign suggested that the police had come under attack from miners throwing missiles, and therefore they had to move in to stop missile throwing. Many of the miners say it was precisely the other way around.
I mean, in terms of what...
In relation to my experience on that day, and certainly refuting the allegation that police threw missiles, I was deployed initially unprotected as part of a police support unit. I was then deployed with a long shield after missiles had been thrown and police officers had been injured. In fact, it was one of the things we remarked on was every time Starlings flew over, we all ducked because we thought it was more missiles coming. Having been deployed at the front as a long shield officer, as the violence became more acute, I was then deployed as a short shield officer, and that was to disperse individuals who were attacking police lines. This happened over hours. So to focus on the actual arrest is the question I was asked about with the statement. And in relation to the types of things I saw that day, I could write a book. But in relation to evidence, as I say, the statement was something I only saw very much later. The original handwritten statement I made is what was my evidence.
So do you think a public inquiry would be helpful to really lay bare everything that unfolded as it did?
I don't know that a public inquiry in itself would. I mean, one of the reasons that I have spoken about this and continue to speak is because I feel that the police officers have been vilified, I feel that police officers were not defended, and I feel that as an individual who's able to express himself, because he was there, he was at the front line, I can give a different perspective. The whole element around this is, it was more than 30 years ago. It was a symptom of the times. It was a symptom of a dispute that was very difficult to deal with, both for the police and the miners. I came from a family of Welsh miners, so in relation to that, it wasn't as though the issues around it were anything that I was unaware of. The thing was, we were there to preserve the peace.
Good evening. Today, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, told the Police Federation conference that the 1989 Hillsborough disaster must be the touchstone for everything the police does. The Hillsborough report, which found that 96 fans who died had been unlawfully killed, has given succour to the families of miners involved in the so-called Battle of Orgreave, with the same South Yorkshire police force during the 1984-1985 miners' strike. They are demanding a public inquiry into those events, which led to 120 police and pickets injured and 93 arrests. Calls that are being taken increasingly seriously by the government. John Sweeney spent the day at Rotherham in the shadow of the former coking plant.
One police force twice under suspicion. After the shame of Hillsborough, now South Yorkshire Police faces calls for an inquiry into what became known as the Battle of Orgreave, fought here 32 years ago. The narrative as told by the South Yorkshire Police investigation was that the striking miners were pretty much on that ridge there where those fancy new homes are being built. The police were down here and the miners were throwing rocks and stones at the police lines. The police had no choice but to react, and the mounted police charged, and so began the Battle of Orgreave. Now there's a stack of evidence that that narrative simply isn't true.
The miners thought if they could stop those lorries leaving, that would help them win the strike. But it didn't work. There was violence that day. It erupted. It got very bad. Stones were thrown. Police horses were sent in to charge the crowd.
Now, the miners' strike remains one of the most bitter industrial disputes in living memory. The so-called Battle of Orgreave, violent clashes between police and striking miners, happened in June 1984. Well, later this month, the Home Secretary is expected to announce an investigation into the conduct of police officers. However, some campaigners fear the truth will remain buried. Dan Johnson has the story.
The miners' strike, a year of picket line confrontation between police and striking miners. But of all the clashes, it was what happened at Orgreave in June 1984 that has never been forgotten, that is remembered as a battle. What made Orgreave different was its scale. Thousands of police officers faced even more striking miners. The police said they came under attack from rioting pickets who were unlawfully trying to stop others getting to work. The miners said they were exercising their lawful right to picket when they were brutally attacked and falsely charged with rioting. Steph Wazowski, a miner from Nottinghamshire, was arrested that day. He was charged with riot but cleared in court a year later when the prosecution case collapsed.
Two police officers here had got both my arms and they said they were under arrest, and I said, what am I under arrest for? They says, throwing stones at police officers. So I said, look at my hands, they're clean. I said, I haven't thrown nothing. They all say that when they get caught. They thrown me, bounced me off the riot shields, the long interlocking ones, busted on my face, opened them up, and then they basically knocked 10 bells of crap out of me there.
It's not just brutality the police stand accused of. Many of the miners were charged with riot, a serious offence which could have meant long prison sentences. To prove that, the police needed plenty of evidence, but there are questions about the way that evidence was gathered. In the police lines at Orgreave were officers from at least 10 different forces. PC Bob Bird was among them, bussed in from the West Midlands. He remains convinced that the violence from some of the miners meant they had to be arrested.
I'm only speaking as one of the grunts who was there with a shield. I didn't see or hear or have any party to people who, for no point at all, were arrested and then were fitted up with charges that had nothing to do with their actions. Police officers, I think, on that day arrested people for legitimate offences. The charging decisions that they made after that event had nothing to do with the veracity of why they were arrested in the first place.
4 years ago, Inside Out revealed crucial documents from Orgreave, police statements that showed dozens of officers had written the same passages, virtually word for word.
It's very obvious in the Orgreave cases that there was widespread collusion.
Eventually the pickets were repelled and they retreated. There was, however, a continual barrage of missiles.
You can't get statements written in the way that they have been done here by police officers from different forces involved in different arrests and find such a degree of similarity between their statements without there being some degree of collusion.
The Home Secretary Amber Rudd is expected to announce this afternoon whether or not to hold an inquiry into police tactics at the so-called Battle of Orgreave during the miners' strike in 1984. Thousands of pickets trying to prevent lorries leaving the Orgreave cokeworks near Rotherham clashed with nearly 5,000 police officers in what was the most violent confrontation of the dispute. More than 120 officers and miners were injured and 93 people were arrested. Campaigners claim police used excessive force and manufactured statements. Well, let's talk now to our reporter Dan Johnson at Orgreave. And Dan, have you heard anything more to clarify that that statement will come this afternoon?
It does look like we will get that announcement from the Home Secretary. She promised campaigners last month that she would give them a decision by the end of October, and they've had no indication of what her decision is so far, but no indication that she wouldn't give them a decision by the end of October. So today is her last chance, and it's Home Office questions in the Commons this afternoon, so that would seem the obvious opportunity for her to make the government's position clear on this. That cokeworks that they were fighting over here that day is long gone, but the battle that took place here, the so-called Battle of Orgreave, certainly has not been forgotten, especially amongst the miners, especially amongst those campaigners who have been arguing for a public inquiry into what went on here that day. No one will forget if they were part of it, the police officers or the miners, but it's the miners that have kept the campaign alive, that have kept asking the questions about exactly what went on.
The Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, is expected to announce this afternoon whether to hold an inquiry into police tactics at the so-called Battle of Orgreave during the miners' strike in 1984. Thousands of pickets trying to prevent lorries leaving the Orgreave cokeworks near Rotherham clashed with nearly 5,000 police officers in the most violent confrontation of the dispute. Well, more than 120 officers and miners were injured, and more than 90 pickets were arrested. Let's take a quick look at the background to all this. In March 1984, tens of thousands of miners stopped work over government plans to close uneconomic pits. 3 months later, thousands of pickets travelled to the Orgreave coking plant in South Yorkshire. Their aim to prevent coke being transported to nearby steelworks. The striking miners clashed with mounted police and officers in riot gear, resulting in the most violent day in the miners' strike. Both police officers and pickets are injured. No one is killed. In 1985, the trial of 95 pickets for riot and violent disorder collapses because of unreliable police evidence. 27 years later, a BBC investigation uncovers evidence that South Yorkshire Police has dictated statements given by officers in 1984. In the same year, the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign is launched. And today, the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, expected to make a decision on whether to hold an inquiry into police conduct at the Battle of Orgreave. Let's go to our political correspondent, Chris Mason. It's a battle that still goes on and was influenced hugely by the inquest into the Hillsborough disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're 32 years on now from the events at Orgreave between Sheffield and Rotherham. But as you say, what's turbocharged the campaign of those who were caught up in Orgreave on the day and have argued ever since that what happened was deeply wrong and have been deeply critical of South Yorkshire Police was the inquiry, the independent inquiry into the events at Hillsborough, policed by that same force.
Chris,
yeah.
I'm going to stop you because I'm just hearing that she's decided against an inquiry.
Right. Well, that's quite something, not least because there's been a building sense of anticipation that there might be something as we were counting down towards Home Office questions when the Home Secretary is appearing before MPs in the Commons in the next 10 minutes or so. I know because we've heard from them this morning that a good number of Orgreave campaigners are here at Westminster.
Want to take you straight to Westminster because families and campaigners are giving an impromptu press conference. Their reaction to news that there will be no government inquiry into the goings-on at Orgreave during the miners' strike.
At Orgreave on 18th of June 1984. Since its creation in November 2012,
The campaigners worked tirelessly to place on the political agenda the urgent need for a public inquiry into key questions about the role of the police on that day. The revelations about the role of South Yorkshire Police in the Hillsborough tragedy, the BBC Inside Out programme of October 2012 highlighting fabricated evidence by South Yorkshire Police against minors charged at Orgreave, and the IPCC report of June 2015 indicating support for a wider inquiry into policing at Orgreave are all reasons why this campaign rightly believe that the case for such an inquiry is absolutely solid.
Well, let's return now to the news that the Home Secretary Amber Rudd says there will be no inquiry into the notorious clash between police and miners at Orgreave in 1984. Joining me now from Westminster, Sarah Champion, Labour MP for Rotherham. I mean, you're clearly angry about this.
I have to say I am still spitting feathers about this. I feel that we in South Yorkshire have been betrayed, and how I'm going to go back to my constituents and tell them that they're not worth an inquiry, I just don't know.
There has been a Labour government before this Tory government. Why was nothing done under them?
It's a good question, which unfortunately I don't know the answer to. Still now, I will literally have people that will come to my surgeries and end up in tears when they're reliving that day. You know, they went there, this isn't some mass riot that was going on. This was a sunny day and people going there with their families to protest what they felt was an unjust situation.
Policemen fought with truncheons under a barrage of stones and missiles. By mid-morning, the picketing had turned to rioting.
After 2 hours, the police were tired of being pushed and pelted with house bricks. The pickets knew what to expect. They'd been warned it could turn nasty, and it did.
Good evening. There will be no public inquiry into the violence between police and striking miners at Orgreave in 1984. The decision by the Home Secretary Amber Rudd has provoked an angry response from campaigners who say it's an establishment stitch-up. They've consistently accused South Yorkshire Police of using excessive force at Orgreave and of telling lies. Dozens of miners were put on trial, but their cases collapsed. The Home Secretary said today that she'd made the decision because there had been no deaths or wrongful convictions. Our political editor Laura Koonsberg has this report.
Horses, batons, beatings. Orgreave was a battle between thousands of miners on strike and thousands of police. But there'll be no inquiry, no hunt for more truth, no new explanation.
Minding my own business, that, mate.
One of the miners there on that day just can't understand why.
The things I saw that day, I wake up sweating sometimes in the night when my mind wanders onto it. And that's why I joined this campaign, to get justice, and there's been no justice today.
Why would an inquiry make such a difference to you, though?
Because we could say, we told you so. What we told you happened that day did happen.
95 miners were charged before their cases collapsed, and with suspicions of deliberate brutality and cover-up in the same police force as Hillsborough, campaigners believed an inquiry was coming.
Amber Rudd told all of you, these families here, that there would be an inquiry. The only question was what kind.
She said her exact words were she had to decide what format
it would take. It wasn't a question for us of whether or not it would happen, it was in what form it would take. She said the culture had changed now, that a light needed to be shone.
The Home Secretary denies any promise, but her decision met fury.
I have concluded that there is no case for either a statutory inquiry or an independent review. In this situation, in Orgreave, there were no miscarriages of justice, there were no deaths, there were no convictions. The Right Honourable Lady should be aware. Therefore, it doesn't merit the same level of status as a public inquiry as was required for Hillsborough.
Aren't we right in concluding that the establishment stitch-up that she has just announced today is nothing more than a nakedly political act?
This is an astonishing and frankly shameful decision by the government. The government have led those families up the garden path for the last 2 years.
Whilst public inquiries can in some instances be successful, too often they cost huge amounts of money, they take many years and they don't even answer the question they're asked.
But Labour has vowed to keep pushing and keep promising an inquiry one day.
I'm astonished, absolutely astonished. When Theresa May was Home Secretary, she encouraged the families to write to her and ask for an inquiry. I think they may have just taken the view that if they just refuse to have it, it will all go away. Well, sadly for them, it won't. Look at the Hillsborough campaign, look at earlier campaigns on Birmingham and Guildford. The determination of people to get justice never goes away.
Yes, it's a straightforward game in politics to call for an inquiry. One minister said the hard thing is saying no. But in this case, the Home Office concluded an inquiry with its possible costs and complications just wasn't worth the while. But inquiries don't erase memories. Those there could hardly believe their eyes then. Still hard to believe them now. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's go live to Orgreave tonight, and our correspondent Dan Johnson is there. Dan, we've heard already from some of the campaigners at Westminster today. What have the local community been saying to you there?
Well, I've heard tonight from one of the campaigners here who says this is not over, and the campaigners will have a meeting tomorrow to decide what their next move is. When the miners were chased up this field 32 years ago by police on horseback with truncheons and dogs, they felt they were the victims of an abuse of state power. They claimed that there was brutality, that there were wrongful arrests, that there was an attempt to frame them for serious offences. And we've heard the stories of retired police officers who say that they were told to use violence here, and that they were then told what to put in their statements to try to justify more serious charges. Now, I think the majority of police officers, all of them retired of course, will be pleased with this decision today. But for the miners, Orgreave and what happened here, this campaign, became symbolic of everything that they have lost. It was a turning point in their strike. They lost that. Thousands of jobs went with it. Many would say trade union power has never been the same since. The coal mining industry has gone, and many feel the mining communities have been abandoned and left behind. But one thing is for sure, the communities around here, the former mining villages, won't easily forget the Battle of Orgreave.
Dan, thanks very much again. Dan Johnson there, correspondent in Orgreave in South Yorkshire.
6:40, the Home Secretary's decision to reject the possibility of an inquiry into the so-called Battle of Orgreave in 1984 was a bitter blow to former miners and campaigners.
You might have seen Amber Rudd ruled a formal review out yesterday because there were no deaths or wrongful convictions.
I have concluded that there is no case for either a statutory inquiry or an independent review.
Well, that was Amber Rudd. Let's speak to Chris Kitchen, who's from the National Union of Mine Workers, and I know you disagree with her. Why do you disagree with her?
I disagree with her because fundamentally she's not bothered about justice, she's not bothered about getting to the truth. And that's all we've ever asked for. We're not looking for compensation or anything like that. We met Amber Rudd 5 weeks ago, and we came out of that meeting believing wrongly, as it happens, that there was going to be an inquiry.
Had she said there would be in that meeting?
She said that she left us with the impression that there was going to be an inquiry, but she was having to decide on which form it would take, whether it be a full public inquiry or a judicial review or a panel inquiry.
What are you going to do next as campaigners?
We shall be meeting up with legal representatives. We'll be continuing the fight. We don't take no for an answer, and Amber was going to have to learn that the hard way, that we will continue to campaign to get justice for what happened at Orgreave and wider during the strike.
As long as it takes?
As long as it takes. It's taken 32 years up to now. This campaign's been really started off 4 years ago, so we're already 4 years into it.